Well, thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening, and I do apologise because of other commitments not being able to stick around for the discussion. It's really very hard to overemphasise the importance of the Paris peace agreements. Before their signing 30 years ago this week, Cambodia really was on its knees, ravaged successively by massive US bombing, by civil war, by the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror, invasion by the Vietnamese, and then civil war again. These onslaughts, above all the horrific Khmer Rouge genocide, caused the deaths of some 2 million Cambodians and effectively destroyed the lives of a great many more. Despite multiple peace attempts throughout the 1980s, the conflict, one of the most complex anywhere in the world, seemed almost hopelessly intractable, with the country internally divided between four warring factions, the countries of Southeast Asia themselves divided in their support for each, and the great powers similarly divided, with no consensus on a way forward anywhere in sight. But the Paris 1991 Accords did bring lasting peace to the country. And Australia, working closely with Indonesia, can I think remain proud of the role that we played in making that happen. In the Red Book proposal that we famously brought to the Jakarta informal meeting that was convened by Ali Alatas in February 1990, we initiated the diplomatic strategy that finally broke the impasse. Its essence, in a sentence, was to define an unprecedentedly hands-on central role for the United Nations in the actual governance of the country, not just election monitoring or peacekeeping, but the actual governance during a transitional period, which gave China then a face-saving way of withdrawing its support for the Khmer Rouge. I think it's also fair to say that the leadership of the UNTAC military mission by Australia's General John Sanderson during the critical 1991 to 1993 transition period was crucial to its success. Well, the international community did bring peace to Cambodia and with it some overdue national economic development. But that really is the end of the good news story. As to democracy and human rights, the other two core elements of the Paris peace agreements, it has to be acknowledged that the record has been one of dismal failure. The rot set in early. The 1993 election was a brilliant success. 90% turnout, incredibly moving experience to watch those voters and their families lined up for hours at polling stations, knowing the very high risk of bomb attacks, but with such joyful confidence in the future. But the election did not result in the expected win for Hun Sen, the incumbent leader who'd fought the Khmer Rouge, his refusal to accept the result, and the international community, far too meekly, in retrospect, went along with that. It allowed him to become joint Prime Minister. And this was the last fully free and fair election Cambodia was to hold. Clever and utterly ruthless, in a very short time, Hun Sen had vanquished his opponents, taken steps to ensure no opposition party could meaningfully contest his leadership. His CPP, the Cambodian People's Party, became synonymous with corruption, with land evictions, with control of the judiciary and army, with political repression, with wide-scale arrests and imprisonment, physical threats to those protesting the loss of human rights, and, on occasion, frankly, outright murder. Over 30 years, moreover, Hun Sen has amassed vast fortunes for his family, while almost 30% of Cambodians live barely above the poverty line, and a great many more survive on no more than around $3 a day, with COVID-19 adding immensely to economic as well as social distress. It seemed for a time that Hun Sen's authoritarianism might have run its course. In 2012, you remember a wave of serious organised opposition began to develop, and the main opposition party, the CNRP, Cambodian National Rescue Party, almost won the 2013 election. But this was not an opportunity that Hun Sen would allow to be repeated. Repression intensified on multiple fronts, and with the 2018 general election looming, Hun Sen, in late 2017, arrested the opposition leader Kem Sokha, charged him with treason, disbanded his party altogether. Thousands fled overseas. There are no fig leaves left. Cambodia now can't be described as anything other than a dictatorship. So what can be done now? When it comes to the various relevant international organisations, I'm afraid my hopes are not very high. ASEAN has shown itself to be completely incapable of maintaining any kind of discipline over its members when it comes to internal democracy and human rights issues, with Myanmar just the most recent example. Despite the efforts of successive UN rapporteurs on human rights in Cambodia, appointed pursuant to the Paris Peace Agreements, starting with Australia's own Michael Kirby, it's been very hard to energise the Human Rights Council to take any kind of effective action, let alone energise the much more powerful Security Council. And partly that's been a product of the protection that's been routinely given Hun Sen's government by China. There does continue to be support among Cambodian activists for the reconvening of the Paris International Conference on Cambodia as provided for in the 1991 agreements. But really there's no evident support for this from any of the permanent 5 Security Council members or other key participants, all of whom have multiple other current distractions. And the strongest steps that the conference could take if it did meet again would be to refer human rights concerns back to the competent organs of the United Nations, back in other words to the essentially impotent Human Rights Council. I believe that the greatest hope for Cambodia's future lies with its own people, backed up with support and pressure, not so much from multilateral organisations, but individual countries genuinely committed to human rights and democracy, and who are capable of exercising some real pressure. Pressure in particular in the context of the next general election in 2023 to reverse the ban on the main opposition party and to enable the genuine exercise of universal civil and political rights across the whole community. Targeted individual sanctions against key regime members and their families, basically asset freezes and other financial restrictions and visa bans, are probably the most useful forms of such pressure. After dragging its feet for years, the Australian government at last announced a couple of months ago its intention to enact a Magnitsky Act, so-called, to make easier the application of such sanctions in human rights cases, following US, UK, Canadian legislation so named to honour the Russian dissident Magnitsky, who was tortured and killed after exposing government corruption. It may be a triumph of hope over experience to believe that this will be passed any time soon in Canberra or applied with any vigour when it is, but when it is operational, the Hun Sen government should be one of its first targets, and there are many other countries who can and should be doing the same. Everything I know about the pride and the courage and the resilience of the Cambodian people tells me that the overwhelming majority clearly want the restoration of decency and dignity in the way that they're governed. I live in hope that their commitment will eventually be rewarded, so that Cambodia will in fact at last become the country we all wanted it to be when we did finally put to rest the ravages of genocide and civil war 30 years ago.